Ethiopia just became the first country outside Russia to publicly display the Orion-E combat drone. And if you understand what that means, you know the entire balance of military power in Africa just shifted. At the Aviation Expo 2026 in Addis Ababa, the Ethiopian Air Force rolled out a Russian-made Orion-E reconnaissance and strike drone alongside its ground control station. This wasn't a prototype or a demonstration model. This was a fully operational system that Ethiopia has already acquired, making it the first confirmed export sale of Russia's most capable military drone. And the timing couldn't be more significant, because Ethiopia is in the middle of multiple active conflicts, has already proven it's willing to use drones for devastating strikes, and just added a weapon to its arsenal that changes how wars are fought in Africa. Let me explain why this matters, because most people hear drone and think about the little quadcopters you can buy online, or maybe the Predator drones the US uses. The Orion-E is something completely different. This is a medium-altitude, long-endurance combat drone, which means it can fly at 7,500 meters for over 24 hours straight, covering massive distances while carrying weapons. It's 8 meters long with a 16-meter wingspan, and it can carry between 200 and 250 kilograms of payload. That payload includes guided munitions like the KAB-20 and KAB-50 precision bombs, which means this drone can loiter over a target for an entire day and strike with laser-guided accuracy whenever it wants. Russia developed the Orion through a company called the Kronstadt Group, and it's been in Russian military service since 2020. They tested it in Syria starting in 2019, where it performed reconnaissance and strike missions. Then they deployed it in Ukraine after the 2022 invasion, where it's been used to hit Ukrainian vehicles, positions, and infrastructure. As of December 2025, at least 9 Orion drones have been confirmed lost in combat, according to open-source intelligence. That tells you 2 things. First, the drone is being used heavily in actual combat. Second, it's vulnerable to modern air defenses, which is important for understanding how it might perform in African conflicts where air defense systems are much less sophisticated. But here's the key point. Russia has been trying to export this drone for years, marketing it to countries in Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. But until Ethiopia, nobody had publicly confirmed buying it. There were reports in late 2024 that Russia signed a contract with an unnamed Asian country, but no public confirmation. Ethiopia displaying the Orion-E at a major aviation expo is Russia's way of saying we've broken through. We have our first international customer, and this drone is now available to anyone who wants it. And Ethiopia is the perfect first customer for Russia to showcase. Ethiopia has one of the largest and most capable militaries in Africa, with over 150,000 active troops. They've been modernizing aggressively over the past few years, acquiring Turkish Bayraktar TB2 and Akinci drones, Chinese Wing Lun drones, Iranian Mohaga 6 drones, and Russian Sukhoi Su-30 fighter jets. This isn't a country that's buying weapons for show. This is a country that's actively using them in multiple conflicts, and they've proven they're willing to use drones for brutal, large-scale strikes. Since November 2020, when Ethiopia first started deploying drones in combat, aerial strikes have killed thousands of civilians. The deadliest period was during the Tigray War from 2020 to 2022, where Ethiopian forces backed by Turkish, Chinese, and Iranian drones conducted devastating airstrikes on towns and villages. Human rights organizations documented massacres, the targeting of hospitals and schools, and indiscriminate bombing campaigns that amounted to war crimes. Ethiopia's military chief, Field Marshal Birhanu Jula, said publicly in late 2023 that drones were made for war and that if they find groups of extremists, they will strike them. He claimed the Air Force doesn't target civilians, but the evidence says otherwise. And now Ethiopia has the Orion-E, which is more capable than any drone they've used before. The Turkish Bayraktar TB2, which became famous during the war in Ukraine, can carry about 55 kilograms of munitions and stay in the air for 27 hours. The Orion-E can carry up to 250 kilograms and also stay airborne for 24 hours. That's nearly 5 times the payload, which means it can hit harder, carry more sophisticated weapons, and destroy larger targets. And unlike the Turkish drones, which come with political strings attached, because Turkey is a NATO member and faces pressure from Western allies, Russian drones come with no questions asked. Russia doesn't care about human rights violations. They don't care about civilian casualties. They care about money and influence, and they're willing to sell weapons to anyone who pays. This is where the geopolitics gets really interesting. Since 2020, when Ethiopia launched its war in Tigray, Western countries that used to be Ethiopia's closest partners have distanced themselves. The United States cut military aid and imposed sanctions. The European Union suspended funding. These were countries that had poured billions into Ethiopia over decades, treating it as a key ally in the Horn of Africa. But when reports of genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity started coming out of Tigray, the West had to respond, at least publicly. Russia saw an opportunity. While Western diplomats were condemning Ethiopia's military operations, Russian officials were calling for respect for Ethiopia's sovereignty and blocking UN Security Council resolutions that would have demanded dialogue and restraint. Moscow played the role of the understanding partner, telling Ethiopia that the West has no right to interfere in your domestic affairs. And by the way, we have weapons to sell if you need them. And Ethiopia, feeling abandoned by its traditional allies, turned to Russia, Turkey, China, and Iran, all of which were happy to provide drones, fighter jets, and diplomatic cover. Turkey supplied the Bayraktar drones that were instrumental in Ethiopia's military victories. China provided Wing Loon drones and financial support. Iran sent Mahaga 6 drones, and now Russia has delivered the Orion-E, cementing its role as one of Ethiopia's primary arms suppliers. This isn't just about one country buying weapons. This is about a fundamental realignment of power in Africa, where countries that feel alienated by the West are building alternative partnerships with Russia, China, Turkey, and other non-Western powers who don't lecture them about democracy or human rights. And Ethiopia isn't unique in this. Across Africa, countries are diversifying their military suppliers, moving away from dependence on Western equipment and toward more flexible relationships with countries like Russia and China. Russia has been aggressively expanding its military presence in Africa over the past decade, selling weapons, deploying mercenaries through groups like Wagner and Africa Corps, and signing defense agreements with governments from Mali to Sudan to the Central African Republic. The Orion-E sale to Ethiopia is part of that broader strategy. But let's talk about what this drone actually means for conflicts in Africa, because that's where the real impact will be felt. African conflicts are often asymmetric, meaning you have government forces with advanced weapons fighting against insurgent groups with small arms and improvised explosives. Drones give governments a massive advantage because they can strike targets from the air without risking pilots, and they can stay airborne for hours or days, gathering intelligence and waiting for the perfect moment to attack. In Ethiopia's case, the government is fighting on multiple fronts. There's the ongoing low-level conflict in Tigray. There's fighting in the Oromia region, where ethnic Oromo militias have been battling government forces. There's unrest in the Amhara region, where ethnic Amhara militias have clashed with federal troops. All of these conflicts involve guerrilla tactics, hit-and-run attacks, and fighters who blend into civilian populations. Drones are ideal for this kind of warfare because they can track targets over long periods and strike when fighters are isolated. But they're also incredibly dangerous for civilians because it's often impossible to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants from the air. And the Orion-E is particularly well suited for this. It carries optical and infrared sensors, which means it can operate day and night. It can fly at altitudes where ground forces can't see or hear it, so targets don't know they're being watched until the missile hits. And it can carry enough weapons to conduct multiple strikes in a single mission, which makes it far more cost-effective than sending manned aircraft. For Ethiopia's neighbors, this is a serious concern. Ethiopia has tense relationships with several countries in the region. There's the ongoing dispute with Egypt over the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, which Ethiopia is building on the Nile River and which Egypt says threatens its water supply. There's tension with Eritrea, which was Ethiopia's ally during the Tigray War but has since cooled relations. There's competition with Kenya over regional influence. And there's instability in Somalia, where Ethiopia has deployed troops multiple times. If Ethiopia starts using the Orion-E for cross-border operations, or shows that it's willing to strike targets in neighboring countries, that could trigger an arms race across the Horn of Africa. And Russia knows this. Every time a country like Ethiopia adopts Russian military technology, it creates demand in neighboring countries who feel they need to match that capability. If Ethiopia has the Orion-E, then Egypt might want it too. Or Sudan. Or Kenya. Russia doesn't just benefit from selling one batch of drones. They benefit from creating a market where multiple countries are competing to acquire the same technology, and Russia is the only supplier. But there's another layer to this that's even more concerning. The Orion-E is a Russian system, which means it comes with Russian technicians, Russian training, and potentially Russian military advisors embedded in Ethiopia's defense infrastructure. This is how influence works. You don't just sell a weapon and walk away. You create dependencies. Ethiopian pilots and operators will need ongoing training. The drones will need maintenance and software updates. Spare parts will need to be imported from Russia. And all of that gives Moscow leverage over Addis Ababa, leverage that can be used to influence policy, secure diplomatic support, or pressure Ethiopia to take positions that align with Russian interests. We've seen this playbook before. In the Central African Republic, Russia deployed Wagner mercenaries to protect the government in exchange for mining concessions and political influence. In Mali, Russian forces replaced French troops after the military junta kicked Paris out, and now Russia has significant control over security policy. In Sudan, Russia has been trying to secure a naval base on the Red Sea in exchange for weapons and support. This is how Russia operates in Africa. They offer military support without the political conditions that the West imposes, and in return, they gain access to resources, strategic locations, and political allies. Ethiopia's acquisition of the Orion-E fits perfectly into this pattern. Russia gets a showcase customer for its most advanced drone, proof that the Orion-E can compete with Turkish and Chinese systems, and a foothold in one of Africa's most strategically important countries. Ethiopia gets a weapon system that gives it a decisive advantage in its internal conflicts and signals to the West that it has alternatives if Western support dries up. But for the people living in conflict zones in Ethiopia, this is a nightmare. Drones don't distinguish between soldiers and civilians when they're dropped from 7,000 meters in the air. When a Bayraktar drone struck a market in Tigray in 2020-21, it killed dozens of civilians, including children. When Chinese Wing-Lang drones were used in Oromia, entire villages were displaced because residents were terrified of being targeted. Adding the Orion-E to Ethiopia's arsenal means more airstrikes, more casualties, and more devastation in regions that are already suffering from years of conflict. And this is the ugly truth about the drone revolution in Africa. These weapons are marketed as precise, surgical, and clean. But in practice, they're being used by governments with poor human rights records, weak accountability structures, and a history of targeting civilians. The Orion-E might be technologically impressive, but in Ethiopia's hands, it's a tool for repression and violence. So what does this mean going forward? First, expect more countries in Africa to acquire advanced drones. If Ethiopia has the Orion-E, Egypt will want it, Sudan might want it. Even smaller countries like Djibouti or Eritrea might start looking for drone capabilities to keep up with regional rivals. Second, expect Russia to use this sale as a springboard for more military exports across Africa. They'll point to Ethiopia as proof that the Orion-E works, that it's combat tested, and that it's a viable alternative to Turkish, Chinese, or American drones. Third, expect conflicts in Africa to become more deadly and more one-sided as governments acquire weapons that insurgents and militias can't counter. The balance of power in African conflicts has always been tilted toward governments because they have access to heavy weapons, air support, and international backing. But drones take that asymmetry to a new level. You can't fight back against a drone that's invisible from the ground and can strike without warning. You can't negotiate with a government that believes it can win militarily by bombing its opponents into submission. And you can't hold leaders accountable when they're using weapons supplied by foreign powers who don't care about human rights. Ethiopia's acquisition of the Orion-E is a milestone, but it's not a positive one. It's a sign that Africa's wars are becoming more technologically advanced, more brutal, and more influenced by external powers who see the continent as a market for weapons, rather than a partner for peace. Russia wins because it gets a customer and expands its influence. Ethiopia's government wins because it gets a weapon that helps it maintain control. But the people living in Tigray, Oromia, Amhara, and every other conflict zone in Ethiopia lose, because the skies above them just became even more dangerous.